Alright guys, it's about time for me to go over how I built this PC. In this video, I'm going to be going over the parts that I used, how I got the OS installed on it, and why I chose the particular parts that I chose, how much they cost, and how you can possibly do it yourself if you're so inclined. So for those of you who don't know me, I am a gamer, trying to build up a gaming channel on YouTube, but in general, I just love video games, and I have every game system that they have out on the market, and I enjoy every single one of them. I have always loved using consoles, and PC gaming is really kind of one of those little side things that I never really got too much into until I actually started my YouTube gaming channel, and then I of course wanted to play the PC ports of games. I want to do a whole bunch of stuff, and that includes having to record and play games at the same time. So what I originally wanted to do was, I had bought a computer to do the game recording and stuff like that from consoles, but I quickly realized that that computer was insufficient with a lot of today's graphics and capabilities and stuff like that. So it really was a matter of needing to find something that would fit with exactly what I wanted to do with my channel. And that's kind of what brought this all up. So literally, when I started this project, the first thing I looked at were the graphics cards. What was the best graphics card on the market, and how could I build a PC around that so that it would have all of the graphical functionalities that I needed, as well as recording software that I wanted to use. So first off, the graphics card, I decided to go with the RTX 4090. It's the top graphics card at this point, and I actually got it for cheaper than this. I think originally I had bought it for $1,600 or something. This is the current going price of the graphics card that I have right now. It's about $2,000. So now the next thing on my list was, what CPU did I want to use? And I wanted to use a CPU that would help complement the functionality of the RTX 4090, but as well give me the opportunity to do some of the other things that I really want to do with the computer that might be a little bit more logically intensive than just using the RTX 4090 for its particular graphics processing capabilities. And so of course the Intel Core i9 was exactly what I wanted, and it was on sale, so I decided that instead of getting one that was fewer cores than the computer that I had going into this, then I would get one that at least has some comparable cores to it. And for those of you who don't know, I did have the Ryzen Threadripper inside the old computer that I was using for my video processing. Now, knowing the processor and the graphics card that I wanted for my computer, I had a pretty good idea of what motherboard I would need. Of course, with the motherboards, all you really need to do is look at what the slot is, and you'll be able to see if that fits your processor, and most of them will fit the graphics card without much problem. But this, of course, has a CPU socket of an LGA 1700, which is exactly the type of socket that the i9 uses. So it would fit the CPU socket, and because it's using PCIe, and of course the graphics card uses PCIe in order to attach to the motherboard, it was going to fit that no matter what. After I chose out the motherboard, then I decided that I needed to get some RAM. And if those of you who are looking at this are a little bit observant, you'll notice that these are DDR4 RAM, which I did not realize at the time of purchase. And when I got them and I tried to slot them, DDR4 does not fit into DDR5 sockets, and trying to force them will indeed break your motherboard. Luckily I know about that, so I did not break my motherboard, but I also have another computer that does use DDR4, and so I just used this RAM to upgrade that one. This is the actual RAM that I purchased for my system. You'll notice that it is 128 gigabytes, and I decided to get this much RAM because I was going to do not only some video processing, but as well some graphics design. In graphics design, you do benefit from having higher RAM. The only problem here is that for some reason, the operating system that I'm using, which should support 128 gigabytes of RAM, does not support the 128 gigabytes of RAM that it says it should support. And so I had to downgrade to 68 gigabytes, and that kind of throws a big wrench into my plans for graphics design and processing. When I was younger, one of the biggest problems that we had in one of the computers that my brother had built was that the power block was not enough to power everything that he was shoving in that computer. And so I decided to make sure that I had more than enough. This is way more than is necessary to power everything on this computer. So I got this 1200 watt Platinum 2 ROG power block, and that is more than enough to run the RAM and the CPU and everything other component that's on there by quite a large margin. You do not need this much, but it was at a good price. And so I decided to include that just to make sure that if I ever had any future expansion plans or decided to do anything in SLI, then I would have more than enough energy to provide the core needs for those. I decided I wanted to do something a little bit different with my tower, and unfortunately, the tower that I decided to buy here at first wound up being way too small for that graphics card. So for those of you who don't know, the RTX 4090 is one of the largest and longest of the graphics cards that you can get. And so we see this going from one end of the case all the way to the other. The problem is with the case that I got, those fans on the front are just a little bit too far in. So there was no way for me to fit everything into this box, which made a big problem for my initial videos that I recorded because they were all being fit into here, and then I had to take them out, and you will see that as we get to the videos of how I put it together. Eventually, I did finally get around to buying a larger CPU chassis, and it's important to measure out your components before you get your CPU chassis, just so that you make sure that they all fit comfortably within it. Usually they will have sizing, for example, case type mid tower. You do have some idea of how big it is, but you'll really want to kind of see what the actual measurements are before you really commit to buying it. After I got the case sorted out, then I needed some cooling, and I decided to go with the Asus ROG RYUO, or however you pronounce that, for the CPU cooling, and then multiple RGB fans for the chassis cooling. Finally, I looked up the best performing WSSD and decided to get this one, which is a solid state WD Black 4TB NVMe M.2 drive, which has the best performance, at least as far as I've seen, for a lot of the things that I need to do. Didn't need to be the best on the market, just needed to be good enough for the games that I wanted to play and the video processing I wanted to do, as well as some of the graphics processing. Now, when you're building a high-performance PC like this, the type of operating system you buy does indeed matter. I decided to go with the Windows 11 Pro because the Pro was supposed to be able to support 128 gigabytes of RAM. It did not. It kept crashing every single time that I had that 160 or 128 gigabytes of RAM in there. Every single time that I had all of them in there, it would crash. And so I had to just eventually diminish it to 68 gigabytes of RAM. And now it runs perfectly with that. But any higher, it seems to crash a lot. Unboxing. One of the favorites of most of the videos that I watch. Just seeing what's inside the box. I don't know. There's something just kind of primally satisfying about opening things up and seeing exactly what you ordered. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, so the next few videos are going to be me opening up these boxes, kind of explaining what it is. Here you see me opening my CPU, which comes in a very nice container. I'm very pleased with it. Here I'm taking out my tower, and inside the tower box there are also the RAM that I ordered. Now the problem that I have with this RAM, and as you will notice, it does say DDR4. Once again, I didn't realize that it was DDR4 at the time in which I purchased it. And so here, I'm admiring the beauty of the box, but unfortunately it would contain nothing but heartbreak. The Microsoft Corporation CDs here contain the OS that I would eventually be installing onto this system. I have two here because I accidentally bought the Home Edition instead of the Pro Edition at first. Though, looking at it now, it probably would work a lot better right now with the Home Edition. And then, here, I take out the chassis that would prove to be too small. Now, one thing I will say about the chassis is that it was a very nice design. I really liked having the fans on the front, as well as having kind of an open glance into the side. But unfortunately, it just being too small like it wasn't as obvious from the images and description that it wasn't going to fit. And I do wish that when they had, or at least when I was researching it, that I had a better idea of exactly the size that I was looking at. But in the end, it works out and I can use it for other projects in the future. Next thing to open was of course the monitor. And you see me using a very important tool, the tip of a pen, to remove the tape that was holding it captive. But that didn't work out too well. Anyway, in the end, I just wound up ripping it all off, but the contents of this box were very well packaged in a nice foam container to avoid things jumping around and bouncing around. This particular monitor is a 4K monitor. I bought, of course, because of the capabilities of the RTX 4090. I wanted to fully experience the value of the 4K monitor. Unfortunately, the 4K aspect of this monitor was misadvertised. It was not actually 4K, it was 2K. And I did have a long talk with Amazon about this and with Samsung, who sold this particular monitor. So that is something to watch out for. They did eventually change their store page and stuff like that, but definitely make sure that once you install your monitor and you're taking a look at it, that you look and make sure that it's set to the proper resolution that it's supposed to be. Let's skip to the good part, shall we? The monitor itself is really beautiful, and in the end, I actually didn't mind so much the fact that it was 2K because this picture came out beautifully. But the fact that it was advertised as 4K and it came out as 2K, then that was the problem that made me return it. So, here you see it in all of its wonderful glory there. It has the NVIDIA G-Sync, which as far as I can tell is just some kind of dynamic color adjustment or something for the monitor itself. But the monitor was well put together, very lightweight, and it really did have great resolution. In the end, I probably would have kept it if it hadn't been for the fact that it was falsely advertised. This particular box was incredibly heavy, and you never really realize how heavy particular computer components are unless you're actually installing them or picking up the boxes and stuff like that, or if they package them together. Then you suddenly realize exactly how heavy these things are, especially when the parts themselves are particularly heavy. Here we have two really important parts. The cooler system, which you can see here. This is the RYUO 3. It has a nice LED panel on the front that allows you can change that LED panel to be different types of designs, or you can have it display certain stats from the cooling capacity and stuff like that, its current temperature and all that. It does have the RGB lighting on the fans and everything, so you can control that using the software that comes included with the motherboard. And here we have the power brick. So once again, far more power than is absolutely needed for this system. Even for some of the most intense games, you'll never use that much. Well, one of the things that I like about these ROG components is the fact that their boxes are really nice, okay? You know, I'm a simple man with simple pleasures, and having a nice looking box when you're unloading computer components and equipment, it just really adds to the overall atmosphere, the excitement of putting together your own system. And then after putting this stuff down, you'll notice a little hidden thing at the very bottom of the box, and that is the M.2 memory card. So 4 terabytes, more than enough to do most of what I want to do, but I always supplement with other memory devices. And the more boxes, the better. I was actually receiving Amazon boxes for pretty much a week straight in building this thing. All of the components seemed to be coming in at separate times, separate days, and unfortunately it took a while for me to get around to building it, which is why a lot of the things I just had to wind up using in separate devices and projects. But because I was outside of the return window by the time that I was actually building it. So in here, we have, of course, the RGB fans, and I chose the RGB because why not? Like, you can control what color they are. I don't really care much for RGB, but I decided that, you know, if I'm getting a case with a glass look through, then I might as well have the RGB and actually have something to look at while I'm using the computer. It's not that I totally appreciate it. Here we have the actual game card that I decided to buy. This was the AverMedia 4K. Unfortunately, there seemed to be some sort of compatibility issue, and so I wound up using my Elgato 4K instead of the AverMedia 4K inside my new build, and I put that AverMedia inside my old build, which it works perfectly there. The ROG Maximus Z790, this is the motherboard. Was very light, but it comes with all sorts of different materials in there that you use to, of course, attach it to your chassis as well as attach other things to it. It comes with the wireless antenna, which does seem to work pretty well because if I don't have it on and I'm in a farther than normal room, I cannot get internet. So it seems to work all just perfectly well. In the end, this was the stuff I had. A lot of components, and for a lot of people, this can seem a little bit intimidating at best. So, but just remember, all of these parts pretty much just slot to where they need to go. There's really not too much thinking that needs to be involved until you actually get to the cabling. But everything else, it just kind of slots and it all fits together. So don't be intimidated by stuff like this. It's a lot of fun. We're going to have a lot of fun putting it together. Now, the first thing to do is to take out the motherboard. Of course, everything is attached to the motherboard, so it makes sense that it is the first thing that you need in order to put together your computer. I really like the way that this motherboard works. And in all of my troubleshooting, I don't think that it's the motherboard that's caused me the most grief. And it is one of the problems with building PCs is that you have to do your own troubleshooting. If there's pieces that aren't working so well together, you're the one who has to figure that out. But in everything that I've done, I haven't seen this motherboard actually be the cause of any sort of issues. You'll notice it does seem a little bit small. And the funny thing is that when you put in the graphics card, it literally covers up all of that bottom area and that second PCIe slot. So it is a very large graphics card. But the motherboard, I didn't need so many slots. Didn't really matter that I didn't have that secondary slot. It does come with this other PCIe device holder. Basically what it is another M.2 holder. And you open up that cover and you can stick that into the other PCIe slot, and it'll enable you to have kind of another integrated M.2. because you do already have a couple of M.2 slots. It comes with a USB that is empty for you to load your drivers and your new operating system on. But the motherboard itself, very nice. It comes with this little keychain. It's a very nice keychain, high quality metal, high quality fabric there, but it's just a keychain. Don't really care too much about it. Of course, it has the warranty and stickers that you can stick on whatever device you are installing it into, or if you wanted to stick it on other stuff, I guess there's stickers. Stick them wherever you want. But and then of course the user guide, which helps you know exactly what ports are going where and how to install the other devices into the motherboard. So I looked around. There of course are all of your installation hardware, including SATA cables, screws, different mounting points, and of course the antenna. And that's pretty much it for the motherboard. There's a lot of stuff in that singular box. I was very pleased with it. It all looks very nice. Here I'm doing an initial test fit. You should always do this before screwing anything down. Otherwise you wind up like me later on, where you find things that don't wind up fitting. Here I was just trying to see if the motherboard would fit in there. I was sure that if the motherboard fit in, then everything else would fit in. And the motherboard indeed did go in very nicely. The slots on the side are actually perfectly sized for the opening there. It does come with a lot of USB 3.0 and onward slots for everything that you would ever want to or need to attach to it. Look at that. Moving on from there, it's time to screw in all the little screws across your chassis. So one of the things that you really need to make sure, and one of the reasons why I did the sizing as well before, is to make sure that the chassis supports the particular motherboard size that you have, because it does, and your motherboard will come with these spacers that you need to fit into the chassis, and then that's what the screws are going to go into to hold the motherboard inside the chassis. So always make sure that you have everything measured out in place and that every hole in the motherboard lines up with a hole in the chassis, because if it doesn't, there's a problem. It's not the right size chassis for your motherboard. Hopefully you're not like me and you can actually be within the return period and return it without much problem. But if not, then you're going to have to deal with a chassis that's too small or too large for exactly what you wanted to use it for. Unfortunately, trying to do this all by myself, you wind up seeing my big old face get in the way. But this M.2 slots very nicely into the motherboard. As you can see down inside the motherboard right now, there's a small blue area there. That is thermal covering for where the M.2 sits. Thermal covering is very important to have on your M.2 because it can indeed heat up just like any other chipset, and the motherboard usually has small little metal pieces that go on the top that help with the thermal conductivity and release of high temperatures. It's very small. It integrates directly into the motherboard, which gives it the highest performance out of any SSD. Now, as you can see, my big fat arm here is very important for building your own PC. If I did not have my big fat arm in your way, then there is no possible way that you will ever get your PC up and going. So, of course, you take off the little plastic covering, otherwise that can melt and cause problems on your M.2. There are different sizes of M.2, and you have to make sure that your M.2 will fit in the slot provided. Normally, they will have the ability to accommodate multiple sizes, but that isn't always the case. In many cases, you will see that they also have covering on the other side to help with the thermal conductivity onto the heatsink. And so once that heatsink, just make sure that you're removing those little plastic tabs, because they will indeed melt. You'll smell something burning, not know what it is, your computer will fry. There'll be a whole bunch of other stuff that could potentially happen. Haven't seen any of it happen, but it definitely could. Next part is going to be installing the CPU. Now, the CPUs will generally have this little cover on the top of wherever the port is for the CPU. And so you have to pull it, and you'll probably hear a little snap as the plastic thing that's on top of it actually comes out. So just know you're not breaking anything. As you remove that, it's just going to come out, and there will probably be a snap. So the Intel comes in a very interesting little wafer type case that's reminiscent of the quantum computing wafers. But this small little thing is the whole brain behind your computer. So be very, very careful when handling this. It has these little pins on either the CPU itself or on the board that the CPU is going to slot into. And if you bend those pins, you're unlikely to be able to bend them back. I have been able to bend a few back a couple times without having any lasting impact, but your likelihood of being able to do that is almost nothing. So what you need to do, there's usually a little notch on the CPU that will fit into a notch in the slot. And so when that lines up, you just put it there and you kind of have to push it down. It's a really scary part because, especially with those pins, you feel like you're going to break something, but don't worry, you're not breaking anything. That's how it's designed to go together. Remember to remove that little plastic tab that's on the top of the slot. You should be able to see the CPU resting in place when all is said and done. The next thing that you'll want to do is install your cooler. Now, one of the things that you should check when you buy the cooler is, does it come with thermal paste? You will almost always need thermal paste, and some coolers will come with a thermal pad. Do not accept the thermal pad. Use thermal paste. It's very easy to spread the thermal paste on the CPU without doing too much possible damage. So you just use thermal paste. It's far more conductive than the actual thermal pads that some of these come with. Now, this particular cooler is a liquid cooler, but it's not like the really high liquid pumps and stuff like that you see in the like $12,000 PCs and all that. It's just a small little liquid radiator. And so it cools very nicely. It works just perfectly for almost everything that I could possibly foresee to do with it. These little radiator coolers are more than adequate for a lot of things. Those really high-end PC coolers and stuff like that, they just, sometimes your eyes are a little bit bigger than your stomach. There's no real need for it. Here I'm pointing out how the fans need to line up and how you need to make sure that when you're installing it into your case, that the fans aren't blocking the are on the right end of the particular cooler that you bought. I'll also take this opportunity to unbox this wonderfully large power brick. And this thing is definitely heavy. Like, you feel like you're getting a whole bunch of power here because that thing is really heavy. But once again, I wanted to make sure that it was more future-proof than anything at this time. The box has a real nice bifold design. And so on the one side you have your power brick, on the other side you have some cable management ties that you are going to need if you want it to actually close, if you want your case to close. A lot of cases have a small space in the back where a lot of the cables will go through. If you don't have those cable ties, they're going to be everywhere. Comes with a small bag, and inside this small bag there are a whole bunch of different adapters that will help adapt whatever device you're using into the power brick itself. You'll also find your cable that will of course plug into the power brick and plug it into the wall. That provides the power for your PC once you're all finished and done and ready to turn it on. And this thing is heavy. It is really heavy, but it's made of this really nice, like, dyed aluminum. It's just a very nice power brick in total. Just enjoy looking at it. Unfortunately, it's very hidden in the PC case that I have right now, but it does its job, and that's really all you need for it. So like I said, most PC cases nowadays will have the one side completely closed off without any sort of viewing port, and that's usually your cable management side. And so you'll remove the screws on the side, lift off that cover, and then I'll turn it here, and you can see this is where all the cables will go. Now, I don't really mind one way or another about this, but it may be something that you actually care about. Sometimes the power brick will go in the way that all of its writing shows you, and sometimes it goes in upside down. And I don't really care either way, but the thing that you really have to make sure of is that the screws line up as they're supposed to. So as you see, this one, if I put it in properly, if I put it in like the way that all the writing is set up, the screws don't actually line up where they're supposed to. It looks like it, but that's only because of the type of netting that it has around it. It actually needs to be installed upside down. And it does not make a difference to me, but if that is something that you are concerned about, then usually you just need a different chassis. Like, the chassis is really what determines how that's going to go in. And there you go. And guys, this is painful for me to watch because there was a lot of stuff I did in this chassis before I realized that it was not going to be large enough for that graphics card that I had bought. But when you're installing these coolers, then a lot of times they'll come with a brace that goes around the back through over across the CPU. This is so that the cooler itself can be tightened down onto the CPU without actually crushing the CPU and causing damage or bending the board. So this brace is very important. It holds the cooler that's going to cool the CPU in place, and it helps as well with the, I guess, the overall integrity of the motherboard as you're trying to fit this cooler on, because sometimes these coolers are pretty heavy, and especially with these radiator coolers, the cables on the radiator coolers are very stiff, and so they do pull against the motherboard. They do pull in a certain direction. It's not often a problem, but it is something that you need to be aware of, and that's why they have these braces. And now for the moment of heartbreak. This GPU is a unit. It is huge. Like, I don't know if I've been able to really stress the size of this GPU. And it, even now, looking at it while editing this video, it doesn't look as big on the video as it is in real life. Like, this thing is really, really big. It is heavy as well. And you can see now why it is that it covered not only that top PCIe port, but as well the one in the middle there too. There was, of course, the third PCIe port on the bottom, and so I was able to get in everything that I needed to get in. But that's the unit. Here's your power cables. You have 3 of those cables that need to plug into your power unit. All 3 of those ends need to plug into your power unit. That's a brace that I was just showing you. That's used because this thing is so massive that it needs to be braced on the side in order to hold it up against your motherboard so that your motherboard doesn't bend. And if it does bend, then you're not going to make good connections. They're always cold solder joints and stuff like that, which will make it so that your graphics card does not run, operate properly, or work as well as it could. So many different problems there with the weight of the graphics card here. So here, I remove it and you see just how massive this unit is. It's got a huge radiative cooling. Well, not radiative, but heatsink cooling that has some kind of like fan blades, the blades on the side. So, and 4 ports, 3 display ports, and 1 HDMI. And it is just massive. It really is. Poor me. Naively thinking that this could possibly fit inside such a small space. It does take 3 slots in order for it to fully seat. I did eventually have to, or at least try to adjust this. As you can see here, it's quite obvious it's not going to fit, but I was hopeful. I was so hopeful that it would, that everything would fit in place, and it seemed like it would, but it doesn't. Don't let this fool you. It does not fit inside this small little chassis that I have. So, but I gave it a try. I really did. I gave it my best attempt. And after many, many valiant attempts, I finally gave up and decided to buy an actually properly sized PC case. And I'm going to show you the difference in size that this case has to be in order to fit everything that needs to fit within it. Removing the plastic shroud. And I gotta admit, I really do like this PC case. Wound up being very nice. And hopefully you all will learn from my mistakes and actually take a look at the size that will fit in whatever PC chassis that you decide to purchase. So take a look at the difference. Quite massive, is it not? And yeah, it has to be that big, otherwise you're not fitting the 4090 in there. Try and get a smaller graphics card. Don't need to spend so much. Now, one of the things that kind of worried me, even with this case, was the fact that when I went to install this cooler up here, then it was just barely big enough. Just really just not even quite. I had to actually flip it on its other side in order for the cabling to fit properly with the ports that are on the back there. So even with this really massive case, and this case is definitely big enough for everything there, don't worry. Sometimes that will happen where it is just a really, really tight fit. But I switched it over and everything fit properly. So it is the current case that I'm using. It's the case that, if you look back at the beginning of this video, was the one that everything was well installed in. And finally, the moment everyone's been, well, probably not waiting for, but the installation of the graphics card. And so, with this graphics card, you will notice that the metal bars that separate this particular case's PCIe stand slots, whatever they call them, the things in the back, the chassis that holds the actual things into their PCIe ports, then you'll notice that the metal parts, they go right across the ventilation for that graphics card. And so one of the things that I had to do here was, eventually I went through and I actually adjusted this so that those metal parts that kind of expanded the CPU or the GPU slot, that they were removed. So I used tin snips and a Dremel in order to adjust the case there. But it does all fit right down nicely in without hitting the other end of the container. And of course, now that that's over and done with, I now have to sit there and put in the game recording or game capture card. And I wanted to do this now just because of how big this graphics card was. I wanted to make sure that it was all going to fit there, because it really did take up most of the space, and I wasn't entirely sure if this graphics card was going to fit in the rest of the space that I had available to me. And in all honesty, I really do like this game capture card from AverMedia. Like, it works very well, and it comes with a very nice proprietary software that I actually find better and more user-friendly than the Elgato 4K. And one of the reasons why I'm a little bit kind of miffed with the Elgato is because the way that they have their 4K recording software, it's very easy to overwrite your videos. And that's why in my Sekiro videos, I don't have my original confrontation with the giant white snake. And it's because I sat there and I recorded it using Elgato's 4K software, and in the end, it got overwritten. So I was very upset with that, and that's what made me look for a different game capture card. Unfortunately, once again, the AverMedia, and I'm not really sure if it was something that I had done on the computer prior to installing the AverMedia software and all that, but it didn't seem to work really well with Windows 11, and so I wound up moving it over to the other computer. I have since fixed many of the issues that I'm talking about here, and I'll definitely be sure to mention them in future videos. If you like this video, then I'll see that you guys want to see how to troubleshoot certain issues and how to figure them out and solve problems like constant computer crashing, memory issues, and stuff like that. More than happy to provide information on that, as long as stuff like this actually gets the types of views and traction that, you know, would entail me giving more time to stuff like that. This takes a lot of time. It really does. Next down are the chassis fans, and it's very important for the chassis fans. And yes, I'm using this like a razor blade, even though it's not a razor blade. Very important for the chassis fans because there are so many more components in the chassis that can heat up that the CPU cooler and the fans on the GPU and maybe even the fan that blows through the power block aren't going to help cool, and which could eventually cause trouble with your motherboard or other things, especially if there's problems with soldering. Now, once again, I got these particular fans because they were cheap and I could definitely use them. They have this centralized RGB control, which I installed and figured out how to do the RGB through them, and they have all their proper connectors and stuff. The fans you see in the background were the fans that came with the case, but they were a bit noisier, and these fans that I had I specifically bought because they were quiet and they supposedly had greater air movement. So very nice fans. I really like the color on them, the RGB in them. Actually, it's a very smooth RGB. It's not like you don't see the individual RGB bulbs going through. It's just a very nice smooth filtering of color. Next up, you've got your 16 or 24 pin connector that is going to power all of the stuff that's currently connected to your motherboard. Now, some motherboards, including this one, do have other slots that you need to plug more power adapter cables into that will plug into your power brick and power different things on the motherboard. And a lot of times that's more for the high-end motherboards. Usually just this 16 or 24 pin is enough to do everything that you need it to. But sometimes you have to really pay attention to if you wind up needing more power connectors. And it will tell you inside your manual what kind of connectors you need for what kind of stuff you're installing. So definitely pay attention to that. Here, once again, this is one of the more complicated ones. You may get one of the more simple ones if you want to be installing yours. I'm going to show you here exactly where these get installed on your power brick. If you take a look, then there are actually labels on your power brick. And these labels help to indicate exactly where it's going. So you've got these particular groupings right there is for your motherboard. I'll try and show it a little bit better here. All plugs in there. It's the only place it'll fit. Some of the cables will have to actually be merged together in order to fit into their pins on the board. See how they go together like that? I can show it to you maybe a little bit better here. So take this example. Here you have this cable and it looks like, oh, it's not going to fit because this is an 8 pin and this is only a 6 pin, and then what's this other 2 pin for? Well, if you take a look at how the clasp on the top is, how it just kind of like merges a little bit over, then this actually mixes in. And so now you have all of the pins. And you see how it links together like that? Yes, that is actually how it's supposed to go. And it's everyone's favorite time, the chassis cable time. So there, those chassis cables are your HD audio, which are the ports on the top where you can connect your headphones to. You've got your USB 3.0 ports, which are the 3.0 ports for the chassis, and then the lighting and other cables that go through. So that one goes connected right into the motherboard, right where I'm showing you there. There's a slot right on the side, at least of this motherboard and most other motherboards. I don't know why the camera wants to focus on my shoulder and not anything else, but most of the motherboards will have a slot on the side for your USB 3.0 or other USB related slots for the chassis. And then your other slots. Okay, this camera is kind of really annoying me here. Let me see if I can move out of the way for a sec and get a little bit of a clearer shot. There you go. So this thing here is usually your USB-C or other types of smaller lights or connections on the top. Or at least for me, it's the top. Whereas this thing right here is for your USB 3.0 ports. So usually the ports that have the little blue connectivity, they're faster than the normal USB ports. You've then got your chassis LED, which usually will go plugged in near the bottom here. You've got your power switch, which will usually plug into the far end. Well, once again, there will be a diagram in your user manual for the motherboard telling you where these plug in. Now, the HD audio port can be a little bit confusing because not everything marks it, but usually there's only one place that it will fit. You take a look for wherever the connection is that's actually missing one of the pins, because one of the pins is completely blocked there, and that's usually where it goes. Now, in my chassis, it just so happens that the ports for the fans and the LEDs for those fans are actually right next to the HD audio port. So here I plug them in. And so the fans that I bought actually came with a little kind of like a device that helps to split the control. Basically, you'll be controlling all the fans from that singular port. And so that's what this thing is. Goes into here. All of these LED and power cables go plugged into this little brick. And then this little brick controls each one. After realizing my problem with the other RAM, I decided that it was time to replace it. And so I had to order the new ones, and because it was already too late, I could not return the other ones. So I just wound up using them to upgrade my old computer, which now has a 1080 Ti and 128 gigabytes of RAM. And this one, once again, DDR5. You cannot put DDR4 into a DDR5 slot. You can put DDR1 through 4 into the same slot, but you cannot put a DDR4 into a DDR5 slot. I'm not really sure the reason behind that, but there are obviously reasons, otherwise they wouldn't have done it like that. Even if it's just to earn them some extra money. But these things have a very specific slot in the center, and you see how their edges are shaped with a small bezel in between. So the middle is a little bit thicker than the corners. Yeah, so these ones just happen to be LED as well. Now, it is far less important when you have 4 sticks of RAM, but if you do not have 4 sticks of RAM, a lot of motherboards will have a very specific, like, these ports go first, these RAM slots go first, and whereas it's not entirely like super duper important, it is something that you'll want to pay attention to. Just showing right here that it will only go in a certain way. You're not gonna be able to force it to go in the other way. It will only fit one way. So don't worry too much about whether you're getting it right or wrong. And usually that part of your board is strengthened so that you can push in these things with relative amount of force. I wouldn't go about like just shoving it in as hard as you can, but you definitely do have a bit of leeway with the amount of force that you use to get these ramps to stick into their specific slots. My precious. So, like I said, the cooling unit sometimes will come with its own, like, small little pad or little bit of paste or whatnot that they put on that. I don't ever trust that. I buy my own. And there are going to be people who are going to yell at me for what I'm about to do next, even probably for like how I'm wiping this stuff off. But here's the thing. I built many computers in my life. I know what the ups and downs of each way of doing things are. So don't do what I say, not what I do. Use one of the little spatulas, but I didn't have a spatula and there was no way that I was waiting any longer to finish building this computer. So I just used whatever tool I had, which was my finger. So in this, you just want to make sure that the thermal paste gets a thin layer that covers the whole of the back of the CPU. All right. Yes, I know that you're supposed to use the spatula, and if you sit there and put in my comments about how like using a finger is bad for this, that, or the other thing, just know I don't care. My computer works great, and all of the other problems I've had with it, cooling has never been one of them. So I did use a small piece of cardboard as well to help even out the spread there. But yeah, just as long as the back is completely covered and makes complete contact with the whatever cooler you're using, that should be good enough. Definitely get the thermal paste with the spatula. That'll help you spread it. But if you don't have the spatula, then there's not really any concern here if you want to use your finger. Now, if you do buy a cooler like this, definitely follow the instructions for where the AIO fan goes and the AIO controller, as well as the pump. So you'll have two cables, one is a pump, one is for the fan. And so you'll have to make sure that both are put into their proper place. In this case, the AIO is above the cooler and the pump is below. It's time to measure again and make sure that the GPU fits properly with all of the fans there. I did eventually remove that furthest fan there just to make way for a different support that I bought for the GPU. Just because like the GPU that, or like the support that came with the GPU, I just wanted one that fit kind of the theming of the rest of the chassis. So, as you can see, I had adjusted it properly, it all fits, and now I have full access to it. And that is something that you need to be able to be comfortable with doing sometimes if you're building your own computer, adjusting the chassis. The chassis is just usually very light aluminum or tin type metal. Like, it really isn't that much to worry about. If you need to adjust your chassis, then do it. Like, it hasn't ever posed any sort of problem for me, besides the fact that when you do, you can no longer return it. So don't do it within your return window if you can help it. But other than that, it really doesn't make much of a difference. And as you can see, now everything is unblocked. Wherever those metal rods would have gone across, that would have blocked airflow and would have made it very difficult for me to attach my monitors and stuff like that. So sometimes an adjustment is necessary if you want to use that particular case. Now there are cases that you can get that are already open for stuff like that, but it's just totally unnecessary in my opinion. Now this monster of a graphics card does come with its own 12-pin connector, and this 12-pin has a very specific little catch right there. So you just got to make sure that if you're using anything that could replace that it has those extra little pins on the top. Otherwise, your card is not going to work. But it requires all of these pins. It requires 3 connections to your power bank. So whatever your power brick is, it's going to require 3 of those port connections. And that all leads to this 12-pin connection. Now, with the absolute monstrous cables that are being used here, it is really difficult to get in any good amount of cable management. And that's just kind of what you have to deal with stuff like this, especially if you get these really high-end motherboards and high-end graphics cards and stuff like that, and you're not using whatever the proper or normal case is for them, then cable management is going to be tough. I still do recommend doing as much of it as possible to make it easier for in the future. If you need to adjust things, if you need to move things around, then you're not fighting with a whole bunch of cables and trying to get it all to fit in the chassis. You do what you can. There's not usually a lot you can do. And after all is said and done, you can sit there and just put back on the cover. If it fits nice and snug and you don't have to force it or push in the center, then you know that you've done your cable management correctly and that things are sitting very nicely. Sometimes you'll need to make some other adjustments. Sometimes you will need to push it in and there's just nothing that you can do. But if everything goes in nicely, you know that your cable management is nice. This particular computer came with a very nice glass front and side so that you could see into the computer. It is once again one of the reasons why I got the LED fans and the LED RAM, is just because if I'm going to be able to see into it, I might as well like what I see inside it. And I can adjust the colors to be whatever it is that I want them to be. I usually am not one that cares very much at all about RGB lighting or anything like that. But the LED lights here, once again, they were cheap. It was very easy to buy stuff for the LED lighting scheme. And especially with this motherboard and everything else, it really does lend very well to the LED lighting. So just remember that when you're buying. It's never necessary, but if you're going to be able to see into it, you might as well enjoy what you see. So now the assembly portion of your computer is done. You've removed all of the plastic film, and now it's time to start turning it all on and see what you can get. Now, the motherboards always come with a thing called BIOS, and BIOS is a very low-level operating system that will help you with configurations and getting things started with the basic hardware. So, I did try and see if I couldn't boot this from CD-ROM. Used to be able to do that, but unfortunately it's not always the case anymore that you have the ability to boot from CD-ROM. So, in the end, I wound up having to Just disconnect the CD-ROM, load everything onto a USB, and plug it into the back. Barely hear anything. It's really nice. Very nice, quiet startup. Now, I'm one of those few kind of weird people who really enjoy the sound of the fans on a computer. I guess because I grew up with it as something that was always on in my house, like all the fans going on with the computers that were inside the house. So I really kind of got used to them. But in the end, not a lot of people do, and I can understand that sometimes a high whine or a high-pitched sound of a fan can be really annoying, but this thing is quiet. These fans are silent, and the graphics card there, that has two modes, gaming and silent. And if you put it on silent, then it seems like its fan don't run as often, but even on gaming mode, its fans don't seem to run that much. So the whole thing is just very, very quiet. You can see here as things start to spark into life and the BIOS starts up on the computer, that means that it's accessing its proper onboard RAM. The motherboard is starting to work the way that it needs to. I needed to find and attach a keyboard on this, but in the end, it shows that things are at least plugged in properly. And here we go, right into the BIOS. Now the BIOS is a very low level tool. Like, you can control a lot of stuff from it, and not all of it you should. I went into the boot options here to see if I couldn't boot from CD, but I could not. So I just had to wind up moving things in order to be able to install it with the Windows system. And guys, once you get your Windows bootable USB going, it may take a long time for it to start coming up when you boot your computer. Just be patient. It's it's starting. It may just take a while. And so then you go through the whole boot process here. It may restart a couple times, but eventually, if you're installing a Windows operating system, you'll get to this screen where you can sit there and start the configurations. Now, I had a little bit of trouble in mine with its Wi-Fi because for some reason it wanted to connect. It was like trying to force me to connect to a network when the drivers for even the onboard Wi-Fi adapter wasn't even installed yet. There wasn't really a way to get around this. I did find a way of actually skipping this particular section, which once again, if this video gets enough likes, I get enough comments asking, I can absolutely show you how to skip that so that you can actually install your operating system and then go through and install and connect to a network. But yeah, it took a while. It took a while to figure it out, but I did manage to do it. So that you can see here, after I ran my particular runaround, I then got this option, which allows me to continue without setting up the Wi-Fi. So, just so you know, it is definitely possible. It is annoying. I wish that Microsoft wouldn't do that with their Windows operating system, because it's stupid if you don't even have the Wi-Fi capabilities installed yet to force you to do that. But it's not me. So, in the end, just let me know if that's something you'd like to see. And at long last, after everything is said and done, the computer is up and running. And so guys, I hope that you found this video informational, and I hope that you can use it to your benefit to hopefully build your own computers and not have to really worry about or rely on anybody else to go through and start building your computers for you. It is a very satisfying process, and sometimes it can be intimidating. It is more for people who want to save money because, I mean, obviously, I paid far less here than I did, or than I would have had I gone to build it, like by almost $2,000 when I went to measure. I went and I built this same PC with a pre-built company, and it was almost $2,000 more expensive to build it through them. So definitely take a look into that. It is not as difficult as it would initially seem. I promise you, it was very simple, very easy for me to do this. It did take a little while because I wanted to record and do this type of recording that I've never done before, but it works and it was a whole lot of fun. And I hope you guys can enjoy it and appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.